And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. What's the idea? Well, the idea is that the cosmos that God created had become corrupt. And that's a funny thing, because, you know, this is the other thing about Genesis that always hits me, is that that's also true. I told you that the Mesopotamians believed that human beings were made out of the blood of Kingu, who was the worst monster that the dragon of chaos could imagine. That's a pretty harsh diagnosis, but the reason the Mesopotamians believed that is because they knew, as did the authors of Genesis, that human beings are the only creatures in the cosmos, let's say, the cosmos of being, who are actually capable of deceit, conscious deceit and malevolence. And the question is, to what degree does the expression of that conscious deceit and malevolence corrupt things so badly that it would be better that they didn't exist at all? Well, you see stories. There's a story associated with this in the Epic of Gilgamesh, associated with the flood, that has exactly the same underlying narrative structure. In fact, some people think the story of Noah was derived from it, where the gods who created repented of their creation and determined that erasing it would be better than allowing it to propagate. And you see the same thing in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, because the early gods, so they're representatives of the giants of humanity, I would say, make so much noise and are so careless that the original creator god, Tiamat, and her consort, Tiamat, decides to wipe them from the face of the earth. And so, when you read something like this, if you read it from an informed historical perspective, it starts to have a depth that makes it transcend this sort of archaic and fairy tale-like element of the story. It's like, I've read some very terrible things about what happened in Nazi Germany and what happened when the Japanese invaded China, and just what happened generally in the history of mankind. And things can get so bad that it takes the imagination of a very bad person to conceptualize them. And when they get that bad, this is the only kind of language that works to describe them. You know, that's another thing that I've discovered working with my clinical clients, is that when their lives are really not going well, you know, when they're close to suicide, or when they're close to homicide, or when there are things going on in the family that are so corrupt and terrible that they reach back generations and they're aimed at nothing but misery and destruction, the only language that suffices has a religious tone, because there's nothing else that's available to describe what's happening with the proper level of seriousness. And it might be that you've never encountered a situation that required that level of seriousness, but that doesn't mean that those situations don't exist. They exist. You generally do everything you can to avoid being ensconced in them, but they certainly do exist, and the probability that you'll encounter a situation like that or two at some point in your life is extraordinarily high. You'll tangle with someone who's malevolent right to the core, and maybe it'll be you that is, and that'll be a big shock. And then these sorts of things, these sorts of poetic descriptors start to become much more real. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. That's an interesting line, because if you remember back in the story of Adam and Eve, what happens to Adam once he eats the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and wakes up, the scales fall from his eyes, becomes self-conscious, develops the knowledge of good and evil, is he won't walk with God when God calls him in the garden. And so Noah is Adam without the fall, essentially. And there's something that Noah's doing right that motivates God to spare him, or maybe to show him a pathway through the emergent chaos, something like that. And that's worth thinking about a lot, because there will be situations in your life where what you face is the emergent chaos. And maybe that'll be some terrible catastrophe inside your family, or maybe it'll be something that's occurring on a much broader social level. But the chaos is coming, And what you're going to want to know, unless you want to be a denizen of the chaos or even a contributor to it, and perhaps that is what you want, because many people under those circumstances choose that. What you want is to know how you build an ark and get through it. That's what you, if you're interested in life, if you're interested in proper being, and you're disinclined to produce any more suffering than necessary, then you want to know how to conduct yourself when the catastrophe comes, so that you have a reasonable possibility of moving through it and starting anew. So when this old story says, well, God's not happy and he's going to wipe everything out, it's like, well, you might want to take that seriously. And then when it says, but there's one person who had a mode of being that protected him from that, that's also something you might want to take seriously, because you might want to know what that mode of being is, because you might need to use it. And so these sorts of things are practical in the deepest possible sense. They're real in the deepest possible sense, and practical in the deepest possible sense. So Noah walked with God.